They say the king of gods threw his thunderbolt, and the heavens themselves held their breath. The Vajra, the weapon that shattered mountains, that felled demons, that no force in the three worlds could withstand, met a single golden wing, and did not pass. And history, written by the victors, remembered the lightning. It forgot the feather. Now let that question settle. Let your shoulders fall, just slightly, away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be if it feels right. Let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, a vast open sky, the deep indigo of a world still deciding what it believes the air tastes of burnt kusha grass, and something older than memory. Far above, a shape is moving against the sun, not falling, not fleeing, just holding steady in the light, as if the universe had been waiting for it. This story holds no monsters. It holds a mother's tears, a son's promise, a heist that rewrote the architecture of heaven in a single golden feather that still drifts somewhere beyond the reach of thunder. If you enjoy these tellings, you might press the button that lets us find you again, but that is for later. Now, only the sky, so let the path carry you back before the hero, back before the gods had even decided what this story would be, back to the cold stone where a mother wept and the egg that was about to break. Chapter 1. The Debt of a Dark Hair. It began with a horse. Not a war, not a prophecy, not a curse. A horse. Uchchai Shravas, milk-white and radiant, rose from the churning of the cosmic ocean, his mane a cascade of foam and starlight. Every god paused, every demon turned, and two sisters, Vinata and Kadru, standing at the edge of that primordial sea, looked upon the creature and saw not a miracle, but a wager. The sisters were wives of the great sage Kashyapa, each granted a boon of progeny. Kadru had asked for 1,000 serpent sons, and her wish had been granted a writhing, venomous lineage that darkened the earth with their numbers. Vinata had asked for only 2 sons, but sons whose strength would eclipse them all. She had not yet seen them hatch. The morning of the wager, the sky was a pale, fragile gold. Kadru's voice was honeyed, almost idle, as she turned to her sister. The horse, Uchchai Shravas, does his tail hold any darkness, or is it pure white? Vinata, whose eyes were sharp and whose heart was honest, looked upon the divine stallion and answered without hesitation, "It is pure, not a single dark hair." Kadru smiled. In that smile was the patience of 1,000 serpents. She knew what her sister did. Not that a wager, once spoken, becomes a law. "If you are wrong," Kadru said, "you will serve me as my slave, and if I am wrong, I will serve you." The words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. That night, Kadru summoned her serpent sons. They came slithering from every shadow, scales glinting like chips of obsidian, their tongues tasting the air for their mother's command. She told them what she required. A few of the serpents recoiled disdain. A divine being was a cosmic offense. They refused. Kadru cursed those sons to burn in King Janamajaya's sacrificial fire, a death sentence spoken in the calm of a mother's rage. The obedient ones coiled themselves around Uchchai Shravas as the horse drank from a moonlit river. Their small black bodies clung to the pure white tail like a sickness, their scales secreting a dark pigment that seeped into each hair. The horse, disturbed but not panicked, flicked its tail once and then stood still. By dawn, the evidence was absolute. The tail was black. Vinata saw the horse at sunrise. The dark hairs were unmistakable, a stain that mocked the morning light. She did not weep. She did not argue. She understood, with the slow, cold clarity of someone who has just lost everything, that she had been outmaneuvered by a patience far older than her own. She bowed her head and held out her hands, and Kadru's serpents wound a silken cord around her wrists. The prison was not a dungeon of iron and flame. It was a chamber beneath the serpent's domain, carved from cold, damp stone that wept moisture like a slow wound. The air tasted of minerals and old reptile skin. A single high window admitted a shaft of pale gray light, just enough to count the days as they dragged past, each one heavier than the last. Vinata knelt on the wet floor and waited. There is no need to imagine the prison too precisely. A mother's grief in a locked room, the weight of it, the sound of it, the way it fills every corner until even the stone seems to bow, is not a thing that can be measured. It is enough to know she was there, alone, her hands bound, her first son, Aruna, already gone to serve the sun, and a single egg still resting in the shadows beside her. The serpents came to her with their demand. They did not want gold or territory, or even revenge. They wanted the amrita, the nectar of immortality, locked in the highest vault of heaven, guarded by a ring of fire and a wheel of spinning blades, and two venomous giants whose breath could melt stone. "Bring us the amrita," they said, "and we will release you." Vinata, in the dark, heard the words and felt the egg beside her pulse for the first time. The serpent's ultimatum was not a negotiation. It was a geometry of despair. They had given Vinata an impossible task, and they knew it. The amrita was the most heavily guarded substance in the cosmos, defended by gods who had never tasted defeat at the hands of any mortal or demon. Asking for it was like asking for the sun to be brought down in a clay cup, a demand designed to make hope itself feel like a cruelty. Yet hope, once planted, has roots that can crack stone. Vinata, still bound, still kneeling in the damp, turned her head toward the egg. It was larger than a cauldron, its shell the color of old ivory, veined with faint gold. She had carried it for centuries, a second son who had refused to be rushed. Her first, Aruna, had emerged prematurely and now served as the sun's charioteer, a living dawn. This one had waited. Inside the shell, a shape moved, not violently, but with the slow, deliberate pressure of something that had been gathering itself for a very long time. Vinata pressed her bound hands against the warm surface and whispered not a prayer, but a promise. "If you ever loved me," she breathed, "you will break the sky. You will bring me back my freedom, or you will find me dead in this cell." The egg heard her, or perhaps it didn't, and the stirring was simply the natural consequence of a gestation that had already lasted longer than some dynasties. But in the mythology of this world, there is no such thing as a coincidence of timing. The moment a mother's despair becomes absolute, the universe is obligated to provide an answer. And the answer, in this case, had feathers. Outside the prison, the serpent kingdom continued its cold, glittering existence. Kadru's 1,000 sons coiled through the corridors of their subterranean palace, their scales catching the phosphorescent glow of underground fungi. They spoke in hissing whispers of the hostage, of the fool Vinata, of the impossible task. Not one of them believed the egg would hatch into anything that could threaten their order. They had forgotten something essential about the lineage of the sage Kashapa. His children were not merely powerful, they were cosmic rebalancing mechanisms. Every son and daughter born of his union with the daughters of Daksha was an answer to a specific imbalance in the world. The serpents, with their venom and their arrogance, had become the imbalance, and the egg, pulsing gently in the dark, had been incubating long before the wager was ever spoken. There is a silence that falls over a prison when hope has been spoken aloud. It is different from the silence of despair. Despair is a dead, flat thing. Hopeful silence is charged. It hums with an almost imperceptible vibration, the way the air trembles before a distant storm. The stone cell, unchanged in every visible way, was now filled with that second kind of stillness. Vinata did not sleep. She watched the egg. The egg watched her back. The serpents had given her a timeline, though none was spoken. They knew the egg was close to breaking, and they were confident that whatever emerged would be either too weak to challenge them or too fearful to try. Their intelligence network, spanning the three worlds, had cataloged every threat and contingency, but they had never encountered a creature born from a mother's grief and a father's cosmic design, a force that had no precedent and therefore no containment protocol. So the chapter closes on a contradiction. The serpents were right. The amrita is unattainable. No single being, no matter how strong, could breach the vault of heaven and return alive. And yet, in a cold cell beneath their palace, an egg was cracking. The thing inside was not a plan. It was not a strategy. It was a fact, like gravity, like fire, like the dawn that had not yet announced itself to the world. The impossibility of the task had met the inevitability of the answer. And if you listen carefully, even now, you can hear it. Not the breaking of the shell, not yet, but the faint, persistent drumbeat of a heart that has decided to be born. A heart that does not know the word impossible. A heart that will not stop until it has torn open the gates of heaven themselves. The mother wept. The egg pulsed. And somewhere above, in the great celestial city, the gods stirred in their sleep, troubled by a light they did not yet recognize. Chapter 2. The second sun rises. The crack, when it came, was not a sound, but a pressure that rearranged the air. The egg split along its golden veins, and light spilled out. Not the thin, tentative glow of a candle, but a flood. A deluge of radiance that turned the damp stone of the prison into a furnace of white gold. The darkness that had held Vinata for so long simply ceased to exist. She did not shield her eyes. She had waited too long in the dark to flinch from its end. The light poured over her bound hands, her hollowed cheeks, her unwashed hair, and she felt it like a physical weight, warm, insistent, alive. It carried the scent of ozone and something older, something that tasted on the tongue like the first morning of the world. The radiance did not stop at the cell walls. It punched upward through stone and soil, through the serpent palace with its coiled, sleeping arrogance, and burst into the open sky above. Farmers in distant fields looked up from their plows and saw the eastern horizon catch fire. They fell to their knees, certain the sun had fallen from its chariot. On Mount Meru, the gods felt it before they saw it. A tremor ran through the golden halls of Amaravati, a frequency that made the divine wine shudder in its cups. Indra, king of the Devas, stepped onto his terrace and saw a second sun rising, not in the east, where the dawn belonged, but in the direction of the mortal world. For the first time in an age, he knew something close to fear. The Apsaras paused mid-dance, their silks frozen in the air. The Gandharvas lowered their instruments. Every divine being in that celestial city turned toward the new light, and what they felt was not anger. It was a profound disorientation, the realization that something had entered creation that their ancient calculations had not accounted for, a variable that had written itself into the cosmic equation without permission. Inside the cell, the light began to cohere. It drew inward, condensing from a formless blaze into a shape vast, winged, breathing. The eggshell fell away in shards that dissolved into cinders before they touched the floor. And there, where the darkness had been, stood a creature of living gold. He was not yet the size of a mountain, but he was growing. His beak parted, his throat, still wet with the fluid of 1,000-year gestation, shaped a sound that was not a roar. It was a word. Mother. The single syllable resonated through the stone, through the earth, through the vaults of heaven themselves. It was not a battle cry. It was a question, a plea, a declaration, All the things a son says when he first learns that love is why he exists. Vinata, still bound, still kneeling in the whetstone, lifted her face into the golden warmth. Tears she had held back for centuries fell freely now, but they were not tears of relief. They were the tears of a mother who has just understood the cost of what she asked for. She had whispered a promise into the shell. The shell had listened, and now here was the answer. Immense, terrifying, and looking at her with eyes that held no anger at all. He spread his wings. The cell could not contain them. The stone walls cracked and fell away like dried clay, and the wings kept unfolding, bronze gold, layered with feathers that caught the new light and threw it back tenfold. The shadow they cast fell across the serpent kingdom, across the forests, across the distant sea. The beating of those wings was not a threat. It was a heartbeat, amplified to the scale of the world. There was a moment then, suspended in the silence that follows a miracle, when mother and son regarded each other. No words passed between them. None were needed. The hatchling who had been a promise in the dark was now a fact of cosmic proportions, and Vinata understood with a clarity that bordered on sorrow that her son was not a weapon. He was something far more dangerous to the order of the gods. He was devotion, given form. The serpent palace, carved into the roots of the world, trembled. Kadru's 1,000 sons, who had never known a predator, felt the shadow of the wings pass over them, and understood in their cold, reptilian marrow that something fundamental had shifted. They had demanded an impossible ransom from a bound woman. Now the ransom was walking the earth, and it had wings. The gods on Mount Meru sent scouts, divine messengers, who streaked across the sky like falling stars. They returned with reports that made no sense. A bird, they said, but not a bird. A creature of molten gold and bronze, already larger than any temple, growing still, and moving not with the jerkiness of a hatchling, but with the deliberate grace of something that had been practicing this flight in the dark for 1,000 years. Indra tightened his grip on the Vajra. He did not yet know that this creature was coming for the Amrita. He knew only that the cosmic order, which he was sworn to uphold, had just developed a crack. The Vajra hummed in his hand, eager for resolution. But Indra was old enough to understand that some cracks cannot be sealed with lightning. Some cracks are doors. Garuda, in those first hours, was not thinking of the gods or their thunderbolts. He was learning the shape of his mother's grief. Vinata, still bound, told him everything. The wager, the stained horse, the silk cord around her wrists. Her voice was steady, but the words carried the weight of centuries. Garuda listened without interrupting, his vast amber eyes fixed on her face, and the listening itself was a kind of vow. He did not rage. That is the detail the old texts preserve with the most care. The hatchling who could have shattered mountains with a single cry did not raise his voice. He absorbed his mother's story the way the ocean absorbs a river, without protest, without overflow, simply making it part of himself. And when she was finished, he lowered his great head and touched his golden beak to her bound hands with a tenderness that made the stones weep. There is no need to imagine the exchange that followed in any language. A mother who has been seen in her suffering, and a son who has understood his purpose. They do not require words. The air between them was thick with a silence that was not empty, but full. A silence that contained everything that had been promised in the dark. Then Garuda straightened, and his wings, still damp with the light of his own birth, opened to their full span. The world got its first true measure of him. His wingspan stretched from horizon to horizon, a curtain of bronze gold feathers that dimmed the sun. The shadow fell across kingdoms that did not yet know his name. In distant forests, serpents slithered into holes. In coastal villages, Fishermen looked up and saw the day turn to dusk, and then back to day as the wings passed. The creature was not attacking. He was simply being, and that was enough to change the weather. He took flight. The downdraft flattened trees, sent waves racing across the ocean, and scattered the clouds like sheep before a wolf. The sound of his ascent was not thunder. It was deeper, older. The bass note of creation rearranging itself. In Amaravati, the gods heard it and knew that whatever this thing was, it was not finished. It had a direction, it had a reason, and it was climbing toward them. The texts say that at this moment, Vishnu opened his eyes. The preserver, reclining on the cosmic serpent, Shesha, in the ocean of milk, felt the disturbance in the fabric of things and smiled. He did not rise. He did not arm himself. He simply noted the existence of the golden bird and understood, with the calm of one who sees all ends, that this creature would one day carry him across the sky. The future had already shifted, but that was still to come. For now, Garuda hung in the high air above his mother's prison, a golden shape against the indigo void, and the serpents below him were very small. He had been asked a question in the dark, "Bring us the amrita," and he had become the answer. Not a weapon of vengeance, a son, keeping a promise. The egg had broken. The sky had not yet seen what a promise could do. Chapter 3. The Shadow That Became Law. In the weeks that followed his birth, Garuda did not descend upon the serpent kingdoms in a fury. He simply existed, a golden immensity that circled the sky with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a new celestial body. The serpents, who had ruled the shadows of the world without challenge, found themselves for the first time looking up, and the view had changed. His body, now fully settled into its colossal form, was a geography of living gold. The humanoid torso, broad and sculpted with the weight of ancient bronze, merged seamlessly into the wings and talons of a celestial eagle. Each feather on those vast wings was a blade of polished bronze gold, edged with a coppery shimmer that caught the sun even on clouded days. One feather, at the leading edge of his right wing, was different, paler, a near white gold that glimmered like a scar. The serpents would come to know it as a mark, a detail whispered from one generation to the next. If you saw the pale feather, it meant he was close. No one knew its origin, no one dared ask. It simply was, a silent signature on the instrument of their diminishment. His eyes were the color of hot amber, luminous and depthless, carrying an expression that defied the serpent's understanding. They searched those eyes for anger, for the fire of vengeance, and found only a calm, ancient knowing, the gaze of a creature who had not come to destroy, but to balance, to restore a geometry that had tilted long before his birth. His diet was singular and absolute. Serpents. Not all serpents. The texts are careful to note. He did not hunt indiscriminately, but enough that his shadow became synonymous with disappearance. A Naga court could be in session, the hissing debates of policy and venom in full flow, and a single cloud passing the sun would freeze every tongue mid-flicker. The silence that followed was a prayer. He hunted with the patience of a force that had no need to hurry. From the high peaks of the Himalayas, where the air was thin and the stone was sharp, he would watch the serpent kingdoms below with the stillness of a monument. Then, without sound, without warning, the wings would unfold and the golden shape would drop, not falling, but descending with the precision of something that had calculated every current, every distance, every consequence. The serpents developed rituals of avoidance. Certain valleys, once prized for their warm, damp soil, were abandoned. Shrines to Garuda began to appear at the edges of Naga territory, not built by serpents, but by the humans and forest spirits who hoped to deflect his hunger elsewhere. The offerings were simple: bowls of milk, small carvings of birds, whispered words. No one knew if he noticed them, but the offerings persisted, and the world reshaped itself around the possibility of his attention. In the high forests, where the great banyan trees wove their roots into the bones of the earth, the shedding of Garuda's feathers became an event, a single bronze-gold plume drifting down from the sky would silence an entire jungle. The creatures of the forest deer, boar, the smaller birds, who had no quarrel with serpents, would pause, watching the feathers' slow descent. It was a gift, a warning, and a reminder all in one, settling onto the moss like a fallen star. The geography itself began to carry his signature. Mountain peaks were scarred with the grooves of his talons where he had perched. Certain riverbanks, where the mud was soft and deep, preserved the ghost prints of his landing vest. Three-toed impressions that filled with rainwater and became small, sacred pools. The world was being rewritten in the language of his presence, and every mark told the same story. Something immense lived here now, and it had an appetite. There is no need to picture the terror too vividly. The serpents were not a sympathetic race to those who knew them. They had ruled with venom and arrogance, and their prison cells were still damp with the grief of mothers. But terror, even earned terror, has a texture. It feels like cold stone under scales. It sounds like the wind before a storm. It tastes like copper. And it had settled, now, into the bones of every Naga who slithered beneath the open sky. The Naga courts, once places of languid, venomous confidence, became chambers of furtive counsel. Kadru's 1,000 sons, diminished now in number and in spirit, gathered in the deepest halls, where the phosphorescent fungi cast a cold, blue light. Their conversations were no longer about expansion or tribute, but about survival. Which territories to abandon, which tunnels to seal, which prayers to whisper to gods who had never favored serpents. They had tried to fight in the beginning. A dozen of the largest and most venomous among them had coiled themselves into a living fortress around the palace, their hoods flared, their fangs dripping poison that could kill a god. Garuda had scattered them with a single sweep of his wing, not even pausing in his flight. The survivors did not speak of it. They simply moved deeper underground. The humans who lived at the edges of the serpent kingdoms watched this transformation with a quiet, cautious wonder. For generations, they had left offerings to appease the Nagas. Bowls of milk, sweet rice, small coins placed at the mouths of caves. Now they left offerings to Garuda instead, not out of love, but out of the ancient pragmatic calculus of the frightened. A predator who hunts your predator becomes, by default, your ally. His feathers, when they fell, became relics. A single plume, shed in flight, would drift for days before settling on a mountainside or a forest floor. Those who found them, hermits, hunters, wandering ascetics, treated them with a reverence usually reserved for temple icons. The feathers were warm to the touch, even in winter, and they hummed faintly in the presence of serpents, a warning and a benediction woven into the same golden barbs. The landscape itself was becoming a chronicle. In the high passes of the Himalayas, his talons had gouged furrows into the living rock, channels that filled with meltwater and fed distant rivers. On the slopes of Mount Gandamadana, the shattered branch of a cosmic banyan tree still hung suspended in the air, caught mid-fall by a force that had not yet released it. A story for another time, but a testament to the precision of his power. He was not mindless hunger. That was the detail the serpents found most terrifying. A mindless predator could be evaded, outweighted, or tricked. But Garuda hunted with discernment. He passed over the young, the egg-heavy females, the serpents who had refused Kadru's command to stay in the divine horse. The old texts are subtle on this point, but the implication is unmistakable. His vengeance, if it could be called that, was calibrated to a justice older than anger. The great naturalist poets of the age, those sages who made it their life's work to catalog the order of things, struggled to classify him. He was not a bird, though he had wings. He was not a god, though he burned with a light that rivaled the sun. He was not a demon, though his hunger was absolute. They finally settled on a term that translates imperfectly: a necessary correction, a living amendment to a cosmic imbalance, born to restore a proportion that had been lost. The quiet companionship moment. Imagine, if you can bear to, the silence that falls over a place where every inhabitant knows they are being watched. Not hunted, watched. It is the silence of a held breath, of a decision deferred, of a fate that has not yet arrived, but circles slowly somewhere above the clouds. That silence was the sound of the serpent kingdoms in the age of Garuda. It is not a sound that asks for your pity, only your attention. On a riverbank at dawn, a single serpent lay frozen. He had come to drink, his scales still damp from the night's cold, and the shadow had passed over him without warning. It was vast, winged, impossibly fast, and then it was gone. He was not eaten, he was not seen, or perhaps he was seen and simply not chosen. He remained there, motionless, long after the sun had risen, trying to understand what it meant to be spared by a force that owed him nothing but extinction. The world, in those days, had learned to live with Garuda the way coastlines learn to live with tides. Not peacefully, but predictably. The serpent kingdoms contracted. The sky acquired a new and permanent residence. The gods watched from their golden city, waiting for the next phase of a story they could not yet control. And Garuda, high in the thin air where the sun was a constant companion, circled and remembered. His mother was still bound, the amrita was still guarded, and the real journey had not yet begun. Chapter 4. The Boundary Between Mortal and Divine. The first report came from a divine scout who had crossed the sky faster than a falling star. His words were few, his wings still smoking from the speed of his retreat. A golden shape was rising, he said. Not an army, not a legion of asuras, a single-winged silhouette climbing with the patience of a dawn that had all the time in the world. The court of Amaravati fell silent. Indra received the news on his throne of cut crystal. Around him, the lesser gods murmured, their voices a rustle of silk and unease. He silenced them with a raised hand. "We have guarded the amrita since the churning of the ocean," he said. "It is the line between mortality and the divine. What approaches does not seek to steal a treasure. It seeks to erase a boundary." No one spoke. Vishvakarma, the divine architect, was summoned. His hands, perpetually stained with the gold dust of 1,000 celestial palaces, spread a scroll across the marble floor. He traced lines of fire, circles of adamantine, and the coiled forms of 2 massive guardians. "A ring of unquenchable flame," he explained, "hot enough to melt the wings off any bird. A wheel of spinning blades, its edges honed on the music of the spheres." The 2 serpents he proposed were not Kadru's children. They were older primordial creatures, dredged from the deepest trenches of the cosmic ocean, where light had never reached. Their scales were the color of dried blood, and their breath, even in sleep, withered the air. Vishvakarma had woken them with a song older than language. They answered with obedience, their flame-filled eyes blinking open for the first time in an age. In the great vault beneath the central spire, the wheel of blades was assembled. Each spoke was a sliver of adamantine, forged in the core of a collapsing star, and polished until it reflected no light, only a profound, depthless absence. The wheel turned within a frame of celestial bronze, its edges singing a frequency that could sever the subtle bodies that held the soul together. The gods watched it spin and said nothing. The ring of fire was the outermost defense. It rose from the floor to the vaulted ceiling in a wall of liquid flame, fed not by fuel, but by the eternal chants of fire priests who had tended the sacred Agni since before the first word was spoken. The heat was so absolute that even the divas, standing at the observation gallery, had to shield their eyes. Beyond the flames, the amrita pot shimmered like a second captive sun. Indra walked the perimeter of the vault alone. He had shattered Vitra, the dragon of Drought. He had carved canyons with the Vajra and rearranged the geography of the earth. But the creature climbing toward him was not a demon. It was a sun. The distinction troubled him in a way he could not articulate. He paused before the spinning wheel, its blades whispering past, and saw his own fractured reflection staring back. The divine armories of Amaravati opened their golden doors. Rows of armor, forged by the Ribhus and polished to a mere gleam, were lifted from their stands by silent attendants. Bows that could fire 1,000 arrows in a single thought were strung and tested. Chariots of celestial fire, their wheels rimmed with lightning, rolled into formation. The Devas prepared not with the frenzy of fear, but with the heavy, solemn professionalism of soldiers who understood the odds. By evening, a strange stillness had settled over the celestial city. The gardens of Nandana, usually alive with the music of Gandharvas and the dancing of Apsaras, lay empty. The divine elephants stood motionless at their posts, their trunks curled in uneasy rest. Even the sacred river Ganga, which flowed through the city on its long descent to earth, seemed to slow, its waters hushed, its surface holding the reflection of a sky that was no longer empty. Indra climbed alone to the highest rampart, a narrow ledge of white marble that overlooked the entire vault of heaven. The stars were emerging, cold and indifferent, and there, just above the distant rim of the world, a point of gold was rising. It was still small, still silent, but it had a shape now. Wings. The Vajra hummed in his hand with an eagerness that felt almost like fear, and Indra tightened his grip. The Vajra was not merely a weapon. It was a theorem, made physical the concentrated essence of divine authority, forged from the bones of a sage who had given his life so that the gods might have a tool capable of enforcing cosmic law. In Indra's grip, it vibrated with a frequency that could be felt in the teeth, a low, continuous hum that spoke of mountains reduced to gravel, of oceans boiled to salt. He had never faced an adversary who was not, in some fundamental sense, an enemy. The Asuras were forces of chaos, disruptors of ritual, lovers of darkness. They could be hated, and hatred was a clean, sharp emotion that made the Vajras sing. But the shape climbing through the dusk was not hateful. It was inevitable. And inevitability, Indra was discovering, was harder to strike than evil. The two great serpents coiled around the amrita pot in the chamber beneath the fire and the blades. Their bodies formed a living vault, scales overlapping scales, like the plates of a divine armor. Their breath, exhaled in slow, rhythmic waves, turned the air to a visible amber vapor that would dissolve the lungs of any creature that inhaled it. They had no loyalty to the gods. They had only hunger and obedience, and both were absolute. In the lower halls, the Devas armed themselves in silence. There were no war chants, no boasts. The younger gods, those who had never fought in the great Ashura wars, adjusted their golden vambraces with trembling fingers. The older ones, who remembered Vitra and the chaos before order, simply closed their eyes and breathed. They had seen impossible things before. They had never seen this. The divine archer, stationed at the outermost gate, tested his bowstring a single crystalline note that echoed through the marble corridors. His quiver held arrows tipped with the concentrated light of 100 suns, each one capable of pursuing its target across the curve of space. He was the finest marksman in the 3 worlds, and yet, looking at the approaching shape, He understood that accuracy was meaningless against something too large to miss. There is a particular stillness that settles over soldiers in the hour before a battle they are not certain they can win. It is not fear. Fear is a hot, active thing. This is colder, deeper, a quiet that strips away pretense and leaves only the essential question. What is worth dying for? For the gods, the answer was the amrita, the nectar that maintained the boundary between the mortal and the divine. They were not wrong to defend it, but the creature approaching was not wrong to seek it. Indra felt the quiet companionship of the moment, without naming it. He was not alone, not truly. Across the vast distance, the golden shape climbing toward him also knew what it was to carry an impossible weight, to be the answer to a prayer spoken in a dark room. Two beings on opposite sides of a law, each holding the conviction that they were right, and the space between them was closing. The final preparations were made without ceremony. The ring of fire was stoked until it roared with the voice of 1,000 conflagrations. The spinning wheel of blades was set to its highest velocity, its edges singing a high, thin note that bordered on silence. The serpents tightened their coils around the amrita pot, their flame-filled eyes tracking the movements of every god who entered the chamber. Amaravati was ready, or as ready as a city could be for something that had no precedent. Garuda's form was now visible to the naked eye. He was no longer a point of light, but a distinct silhouette, wings spanning the horizon, bronze gold feathers catching the last light of the sun, the pale feather on his right wing glinting like a scar. He was not hurrying. His approach was measured, inevitable, the flight of a creature who had spent 1,000 years in an egg and had learned, in that darkness, that patience is the highest form of power. Indra stepped back from the rampart. The Vajra, still humming, still eager, felt heavier than it ever had. He descended through the marble halls to the inner vault, past the fire and the blades, and stood before the two serpents and the amrita pot they guarded. The nectar glowed with a soft, immortal light. He had protected it for eons. Tonight, he would find out if eons were enough. The sky, when he at last looked, was entirely gold. Chapter 5. The Silence. After the strike. He did not attack so much as arrive, and his arrival was a weather system of gold. The light of Amaravati, that eternal, perfect dawn, dimmed under the shadow of wings that stretched from one horizon of heaven to the other. The spires of the celestial city, which had never known a cloud, vanished into the darkness of his passing, and the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient purpose. The divine archer at the outermost gate released his arrow. It left his bow as a bolt of concentrated sunlight, a perfect seeking missile that had never missed its target in all the wars of the gods. Garuda did not evade it. A single feather, flicked from his wing by an almost imperceptible gesture, met the arrow in mid-flight and shattered it into a shower of harmless sparks. He did not even slow his approach. The ring of fire that had roared from floor to vaulted ceiling, that had been fed by the eternal chants of fire priests, felt the downdraft of his wings before it felt him. It was a pressure first, a deep, thrumming bass that made the flames shudder. Then came the wind, a gale of impossible force, and the fire, starved of its own breath, folded inward and collapsed. It did not explode. It simply died, like a candle in a hurricane. Beyond the dead ring of fire, the spinning wheel of adamantine blades sang its high, thin note. It was a disk of absolute absence, a void that cut. Garuda, his body immense beyond the gates, paused. The gods watching from the galleries felt a flicker of hope, a hesitation, a sign of doubt, and then the great golden form began to shrink, contracting with a swift and silent grace until he was no larger than a mote of dust, a single point of light that passed effortlessly between the whirling blades. He reformed on the other side, his body expanding back to its colossal scale in a heartbeat. And the gods understood with a cold, sinking clarity that their defenses were not barriers. They were delays. Beautiful, intricate, meticulously engineered delays that had been dismantled one by a creature who had not yet spoken a single word of threat or malice. The two primordial serpents uncoiled from their guard around the amrita pot. Their scales, the color of dried blood, scraped against the marble floor with a sound like grinding stone. They opened their mouths, and the amber vapor of their breath, which could dissolve the lungs of any living thing, rolled toward Garuda in a suffocating wave. He looked at them with his calm, ancient eyes, and from those eyes came a light, not a blast, but a steady, golden beam that pierced the vapor and struck the serpents full in their flame-filled gazes. It was not a killing light. It was a dismissal. The serpents, their ancient minds flooded with a radiance that burned away all hunger and all obedience, recoiled and slithered into the shadows at the edges of the vault. They did not flee. They simply ceased to obstruct, curling into themselves like questions that had been answered and found no further purpose. The amrita pot stood unguarded for the first time since the churning of the ocean. Garuda did not rush to the nectar. He stood still, his wings folding slowly against his back, his amber gaze sweeping the vault with the quiet reverence of a pilgrim who has reached the end of a very long road. The amrita glowed before him, soft and immortal, its light reflecting in his golden feathers. He had crossed every barrier the gods had set. The prize was his, and still he waited, because he knew the last barrier was not a thing, but a god. Indra stepped from the shadows of the inner sanctum. The Vajra was blazing in his hand, its light carving jagged shadows across the marble walls. The two figures faced each other across the glowing amrita pot. The king of the gods and the son who had climbed through every defense to stand where no mortal or demon had ever stood. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say that lightning could not say better. Indra drew back his arm. The Vajra left his hand not as a bolt, but as a therium, the concentrated, irreducible statement of divine authority, the power that had shattered Vitra and carved the canyons of the earth. It crossed the distance between them in a fraction of a heartbeat, a spear of absolute white, and struck Garuda full in the chest. The sound it made was the sound of an old world ending. And then, silence. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the ringing absence of the thunderbolt's echo, a sound that every god in the vault had expected to be followed by the collapse of a body. But Garuda did not fall. He did not stagger. He stood exactly as he had stood before the Vajra struck, his golden chest unmarked, his amber eyes calm. The therium of divine authority had met a fact it could not rewrite. The Vajra's light, which had never failed to consume its target, was not extinguished. It was absorbed. The jagged branches of the thunderbolt crawled across Garuda's feathers like living veins of white fire, seeking a wound that did not exist. They crackled and spat and slowly faded, leaving behind only the faint scent of scorched gold. The weapon had given everything it had. It had not been enough. Garuda looked down at his chest, where the lightning had struck, and then he looked at Indra. There was no triumph in his gaze, no mockery, no anger. There was only a deep, ancient recognition, the look of one being acknowledging another who had done everything his duty demanded. The king of the gods had thrown the most powerful weapon in creation. The sun had received it, and now something was owed. He raised his right wing. The motion was slow, deliberate, as graceful as everything else he had done since emerging from the egg. The gods in the galleries, still frozen, still silent, saw the pale feather at the leading edge of that wing, the one that had always been different, a near white gold that glimmered like a scar, and understood, in that instant, that it had always been meant for this moment. Garuda plucked the feather with his beak. It came away without resistance, as if it had been waiting to be shed. For a long, suspended moment, he held it before him, and then he released it. The feather drifted down through the still air of the vault, turning slowly, catching the lights of the amrita and the fading afterglow of the vajra. It was not a surrender. It was a gift, a tribute to the weapon that had tried and failed, and to the god who had thrown it. Indra watched the feather fall. The vajra, still humming faintly in his hand, felt lighter now, not diminished, but changed. The weapon that had always been an instrument of absolute certainty had encountered a being who had not defied it, but had simply been beyond it. And in offering a piece of himself, Garuda had done something more powerful than victory. He had made the thunderbolt a witness, not a failure. The feather settled on the marble floor between them. It lay there, pale and gleaming, a small, quiet testament to the moment the old cosmic order had cracked open. Garuda lowered his wing. Indra lowered his arm. The amrita pot glowed on its pedestal, and the two beings regarded each other across its soft, immortal light. No treaty was signed. No words were spoken. But something in the architecture of heaven had shifted, and it would never shift back. There is a stillness that comes after an impossible event. It is not the stillness of peace. It is the stillness of reorientation, the pause a mind takes when it must rebuild its understanding of what is possible. That stillness filled the vault of the amrita. The gods in the galleries did not flee. They did not attack. They simply stood, their weapons lowered, their faces open, and watched the Golden King and the King of the Gods share a silence that was more binding than any oath. Garuda turned to the amrita pot. His talons, which had scarred the peaks of the Himalayas, closed around the vessel with a gentleness that would have broken the heart of anyone who understood what it had cost him to reach this moment. He lifted it. The nectar of immortality, the boundary between the mortal and the divine, was now in the keeping of a son who had promised his mother he would bring it home. He did not drink. He did not even pause. The promise was still the point. And then, with the amrita held close and the pale feather still resting on the marble floor behind him, Garuda unfurled his wings and rose through the broken defenses of heaven. No god moved to stop him. The old order had died not with a scream, but with a feather falling. And the creature who had been born in a cold cell, to a mother's tears and an impossible promise, began the long flight home carrying the nectar he would never taste, to a freedom he had already won. Chapter 6. The Debt of the Sacred Grass. The sky above the broken vault of heaven was vast and silent, an indigo emptiness that asked nothing of him. Garuda flew with the amrita pot cradled against his chest, its immortal light warming his feathers. He had crossed every barrier the gods had set. He had weathered the thunderbolt. The nectar was his. And yet, he did not drink. The promise was still the point. His wing beats, which had been a storm, slowed now to a steady, rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of a creature who had done what he came to do and was simply returning home. Below him, the serpent kingdoms coiled in their dark valleys, unaware that the ransom they had demanded was already in the sky above them, carried by the son of the woman they had bound. The presence, when it came, did not startle him. It announced itself as a gradual warmth spreading through the cold air of the upper heavens, a pressure that was not physical, but spiritual. The approach of a consciousness so vast and so calm that the stars themselves seemed to dim in deference. The cosmic ocean of milk shimmered on the horizon, and from its endless white expanse, a figure emerged. Vishnu did not arrive with thunder or proclamation. He simply was there, as if he had always been there, reclining on the coiled body of the serpent, Shesha, his blue-black skin absorbing the light of 1,000 suns and giving back only peace. His eyes, half closed in the eternal meditation of preservation, held a faint, knowing smile. He had seen everything. He had always seen everything. Garuda folded his wings and hovered, his great golden form dwarfed by the preserver's serenity. He bowed his head not in fear, but in the instinctive recognition of an order older than himself. The amrita pot glowed between them. "You have taken nothing for yourself," Vishnu said, and his voice was not sound, but a resonance that settled into the bones. "Name your boon, child of Vinata." The boon, when Garuda spoke it, was not what the gods would have expected from a conqueror. He did not ask for a throne or a kingdom or dominion over the serpents he had already defeated. He asked for immortality, and for the honor of carrying Vishnu upon his back for all eternity, to be the Vahana of the preserver, the wings beneath the one who sustained the worlds. Vishnu's smile deepened, if such a thing were possible, and he raised one dark hand in a gesture of blessing. The light that passed between them was not the searing blaze of the Vajra, but a gentle, permeating radiance that sank into Garuda's feathers and became part of their permanent gold. It was done. The son of Vinata, born in a cold cell, was now immortal and eternal, bound to the god who held the universe together. "The amrita," Vishnu said, his gaze shifting to the glowing pot, "must not remain with the serpents, but a promise made must be a promise kept. Deliver it to them. Let them perform their ritual ablutions before they drink, and place the vessel upon a bed of kusha grass, the sacred blades that grow where the Ganga touches the earth. The rest will unfold as it must." His form began to fade, dissolving back into the cosmic ocean like a reflection in still water. Garuda continued his descent, the amrita pot now carrying not only his mother's freedom, but the silent architecture of a divine loophole. Below, the Serpent Kingdom's altar was a cold slab of black stone, surrounded by coiled, waiting bodies. Kadru's sons had sensed his approach. Their emerald eyes tracked the golden speck growing larger in the sky, and their tongues flickered with anticipation. They had won, they believed. The nectar of immortality was coming. He landed before the altar with a gentleness that belied his size, his talons touching the stone without a sound. The amrita pot, glowing with its soft, captive sun, he placed upon the bed of sharp kusha grass that had been prepared, though the serpents, in their greed, paid no attention to the grass. They saw only the nectar. They lunged forward, their mouths open, their tongues extended, and the grass was waiting. The kusha grass was sharp. Its blades, sacred to the gods and blessed by the touch of the Ganga, had edges finer than any honed steel. The serpents, drunk on the scent of immortality, did not see the trap. They did not feel the first cut. Their tongues, extended to lap at the glowing nectar, met the grass before they met the amrita. The blades sliced clean and deep, splitting each forked tongue into two. The first serpent recoiled, its mouth filling with the taste of its own blood, mixed with the faintest hint of something divine. The others followed, a wave of writhing bodies pulling back from the altar, their newly divided tongues flickering in the cold air, testing a pain they had never known. The amrita pot sat untouched, still glowing, still full. The serpents had received their ransom, and the ransom had received them. A few drops of the nectar, jostled by the serpent's frantic lunge, spilled over the rim of the pot and fell onto the kusha grass. Where they landed, the grass blazed with a light that did not consume it, and the blades, now forever touched by immortality, became the most sacred of all plants, used in rituals that would outlast the memory of the serpents who had caused the spill. Garuda watched the scene without satisfaction. His amber eyes, calm as they had been since the moment of his birth, held no glint of vengeance fulfilled. The serpent's pain was not his purpose. It was simply a consequence, a geometry of justice that had been set in motion long before he emerged from the egg. He lifted the amrita pot from the altar, his talons gentle and the serpents did not try to stop him. They were too busy learning the shape of their new mouths. The biological legacy of the heist would pass to every generation of serpents that followed. Their tongues, now split into two distinct forks, would be a permanent mark, a living testament to the day they had tried to drink immortality and had been given a wound instead. It was not a curse. It was simply what happened when greed meets sacred grass, a fact written into the serpent genome with the quiet, irreversible precision of a law. Vinata was waiting in the cold cell that had been her prison for so long that she had forgotten the warmth of the sun, the silken cord around her wrists, the symbol of Kadru's treachery, had not loosened in all the centuries of her son's absence. But when the golden light of Garuda's return flooded the chamber, the cord simply fell away. It did not snap, it did not burn, it simply released, as if the lie that had created it no longer had any power. She stepped out of the darkness and into the light, and the sun, who had been an egg in the shadows, was now a mountain of gold waiting to receive her. No words passed between them. The silence that had held a vow in the dark now held its fulfillment, and it was deeper, fuller, and more sacred than any language. Garuda lowered his great head, and Vinata pressed her freed hands to his golden beak, and the universe, for a single, suspended moment, was perfectly balanced. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from the release of a weight carried too long. Vinata felt it settle over her like a gentle tide. She had been a slave, and now she was a mother, standing in the light of her son's radiance. And the distance between those two states was so vast that her mind could not cross it all at once. She simply stood there, blinking in the gold, and let herself be free. The quiet companionship moment. There is no need to imagine what freedom feels like after centuries of servitude. It is not a single emotion. It is a flood of them, all arriving at once, so overwhelming that it can only be experienced as a kind of stillness. That stillness was Vinata's first freedom. And if you have ever felt a weight lift from your own shoulders, even a small one, you know something of that silence. It asks nothing of you. It simply is. Garuda, with his mother safe, and the Amrita returned to its celestial guardians through the pact with Vishnu, rose once more into the sky. But this time, not as a conqueror. He rose as the Vahana of the Preserver, the eternal wings beneath the God who sustained the worlds. The serpents carried their split tongues into every generation that followed. The kusha grass became sacred, and in the heavens a single pale feather still rested on the marble floor of the vault, a testament to the day a son's devotion had outlasted the lightning and rewritten the architecture of the universe. Chapter 7. The Promise That Still Pulses. The ancient sages who first told this story were not composing fantasy. They were charting the shape of a truth they had observed in the architecture of the world. That devotion, when it becomes absolute, ceases to be a feeling and becomes a force. Garuda was their proof, a son who loved his mother so completely that the laws of the gods bent around him like light around a star. In the centuries that followed, that truth was carved into stone. The earliest temples of the Gupta age show him not as a monster, subdued, but as a guardian, ascending wings outspread, face serene, the preserver resting on his back, as if the universe itself had found its equilibrium. The carvers understood what the serpents had learned too late. This was not a creature of wrath. It was a creature of order. At Prambanan, on the island of Java, he still stands in a niche among the lotus petals. 9 centuries of monsoon have softened the edges of his beak, and moss fills the hollows where his amber eyes once blazed. But the posture is unchanged. Wings folded, head held high, the eternal vigilance of a king who chose service over conquest. A few wilting frangipani blossoms rest at his feet, left by hands that still remember. The story, like all living things, adapted to the soils where it took root. In the courts of the Majapahit kings, Garuda became the emblem of a dynasty that claimed divine descent. In the Puranas, his voice became a scripture, the Garuda Purana, whispered at the deathbeds of the faithful, guiding souls to the threshold of mortality with the same calm he had carried through the vault of heaven. On the cliffs of Uluwatu in Bali, a stone Garuda perches above the Indian Ocean, his talons gripping the volcanic rock, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun melts into the sea. Pilgrims climb the steep steps each morning with offerings of fruit and incense. They are not appeasing a monster. They are honoring a protector, a son who kept his promise, a being who proved that love can be a kind of lightning. The modern world, with its steel and its skepticism, did not discard him. When the Indonesian archipelago forged a national identity from 1,000 scattered islands, it looked to the old stories and found the golden bird waiting. The Garuda Pancasila, a coat of arms of breathtaking complexity, spreads its wings in cabinet rooms and schoolyards, its talons gripping a scroll that speaks of unity and diversity. The eyes are the same. Those eyes, painted in gold on passports and currency, look down on a nation that has known struggle, and the silent message is not lost on those who care to read it. This symbol was not chosen for its ferocity. It was chosen for what it overcame the impossible odds, the prison of circumstance, the thunderbolt that could not break it. A country like a sun can rise from the dark and claim its place among the heavens. And in a different kind of sky, the name itself takes flight. A Garuda Indonesia aircraft lifts off from Jakarta, its fuselage painted with a stylized wing, its engines roaring with a power that would be nothing to the creature it is named for. The passengers settling into their seats do not think of the amrita or the vajra, but the name persists, a quiet, unspoken echo, a myth that learned to fly on metal wings because it had already flown on feathers of gold. If you could go back, past the temples and the flags and the aircraft, past the centuries of stone and scripture, you would find Vinata's cell. It is empty now. The damp has dried. The high window admits only dust motes, and the memory of a light that once poured through and dissolved a mother's bonds. There is no plaque, no sign. The deepest places of transformation rarely bear a mark, but they hold their silence like a held breath. And in the distant vault of heaven, where the shattered defenses still lie unrepaired, a monument, now, to a system that was never absolute. A single pale feather rests on the marble floor. It is not decayed. It will not decay. It glimmers with the same light it carried when it fell, the fossil of a gesture that was never meant to conquer, only to acknowledge. And the acknowledgement, it turns out, outlasted the thunder. What does it mean that a story from the threshold of recorded time still beats in the chest of a modern jet? The ancients would not have been surprised. They understood that myth is not a fiction that fades, but a pattern that recurs. Every underdog who rises against an implacable system, every child who carries a mother's unspoken hope, every quiet refusal to bow to lightning that is Garuda. The serpent, in this pattern, is not merely a reptile. It is any force that coils around freedom and calls it order. The amrita is not merely a nectar. It is any prize held behind walls of fire by powers that believe they are entitled to it. And the feather, the single pale shed feather, is the moment the game changes. Not through victory, through an offering that says, I do not need to destroy you to be free of you. That is why the stone Garudas of Angkor and Prambanan have outlasted the dynasties that carved them. The kings who commissioned those reliefs are dust. The temples themselves are slowly sinking back into the jungle. But the golden bird, with his calm, knowing eyes, remains a witness to the truth that power built on thunderbolts eventually exhausts itself, while power built on devotion simply continues. In the highlands of Bali, at the mother temple of Besaki, a priest in white robes still chants the ancient stanzas that recount Garuda's deeds. The offerings of fruit and flowers he places at the shrine are the same offerings that were placed 1,000 years ago. The smoke of the incense rises into the same sky that once filled with the shadow of wings, and the chant is the same chant. Nothing has been forgotten. The quiet companionship moment. There is no need to be in Bali or Java or any particular place to feel the continuity of which this story is a part. Every culture has a creature who broke the bars of the impossible. Every people has a memory of a time when the order of things cracked open and something brighter poured through. If you have ever felt that story stir, even faintly, you are already in the lineage of Vinata, kneeling in the dark, waiting for the egg to break. The fossil record of the story is not written in bone. It is written in the names we give our children, the symbols we stitch into our flags, the aircraft we send into the sky. Garuda, Indonesia's tail fin, painted with a wing in mid-flap against a field of deep blue, does not carry a monster into the stratosphere. It carries a question, the same question that has been asked since a son first looked at his bound mother and understood what he was born to do. And the question is this: what would you give to set someone free? The answer, for Garuda, was not violence, but the total and irrevocable offering of himself. He did not drink the amrita. He did not usurp Indra's throne. He bowed to Vishnu and became the wings beneath the preserver. And in that bowing, he became greater than any conqueror. The story is a paradox. The son who sought nothing for himself became immortal. The serpents, who sought everything, became a wound. This is the hidden architecture of the myth. The truth, the old sages encoded in the narrative, like a fossil in amber. The Vajra did not fail because Garuda was stronger. It failed because the thunderbolt is the weapon of those who defend a boundary. And Garuda was not attacking a boundary. He was answering a promise. And a promise, when it is absolute, has no boundary that lightning can enforce. In a quiet museum in Jakarta, a single golden feather, ancient, worn, its barb still faintly luminous, lies behind glass. The plaque does not claim it is the feather. It only says, Garuda, 8th century, gold leaf on bronze. But the children who press their noses to the glass do not read the plaque. They look at the feather and something ancient kindles behind their eyes. The story is not in the glass case. The story is in them, waiting. So the egg breaks, the wings unfurl, the mother steps into the light. The thunderbolt falls and does not rise. The feather drifts down through the silent heavens and comes to rest. At last, on the floor of a vault that will never again be absolute. And if you listen carefully, even now, you can hear it. Not the breaking of the shell, but the quiet, steady pulse of a promise that is still being kept. It sounds like wings,